Thank you very much, Tord. Yes, a period of war perhaps is on us. How can we instead make peace? I'll just repeat some of the information, some of the practical information that Tord gave us there. We'll be in this session until 6 o'clock, and then there's a 15-minute break. This session is climate justice in a changing world order. And then the break from 6 till 6:15, and the second session, the younger voices for peace, from 6:15 until 8 this evening. The format that we'll be taking here, we'll have the speaker speak. I believe they prepared for about 20 minutes of speech, and then we'll have a short question and answer for that speaker. And then the next person and a question and answer, and the next person question and answer, and then we'll have a question and answer for all the speakers at the end. And if we finish before 6, then we get a longer break. But that's not an encouragement to not ask questions, because we want to have your questions. We want to make this as interactive as possible. So please use the chat. I'll write something in the chat now, so it will pop up as a notification for you. Use the chat to write your questions, and we'll see them, and we use that order. If a question comes to you only during the question and answer, then you can also use the raise hand function, which is under the reactions in the new update of Zoom. It looks like a heart in Swedish, reagera. But enough formality. We're going to be starting with Patrick Bond from South Africa. You are in South Africa at the moment, I believe, Patrick?
No, I'm in Germany, I'm afraid.
You're in Germany.
I've had to come up here.
I think I made that mistake
using my lifetimes. I think I was here, yes.
Yeah.
Good to be with you. I hope this is coming through okay.
Yeah. Would it be okay, Patrick, if you said a few words about yourself in introduction first?
Yes, of course. I'm originally from Ireland. I was born in Belfast. They call it Northern Ireland. And I was raised in Alabama and went to university in the States, moved to South Africa and Zimbabwe in 1989. And that's been my base. And it's the best window on all sorts of crises and all sorts of ways to connecting people and planet and peace. Since South Africa did come out of apartheid in 1994, I was lucky to work in President Nelson Mandela's office because I knew English okay and I could type quickly. I was the first policy drafter, and then I was in universities, and I'm mostly affiliated in a spiritual sense to the social movements, and that's where I met some of you in the room in the 1990s as we began to generate the internationalism that had helped to bring down apartheid, with Sweden being such a central player, but then the post-apartheid social justice and ultimately climate justice struggles that bring us together. And my base, University of Johannesburg, the Center for Social Change. So maybe I'll very quickly use my 20 minutes, if it's okay to jump in.
Yeah, sure.
By quickly asking your opinions about our changing ideological terrain in which this far right, sometimes they call themselves the paleo conservatives, paleo, Stone Age, in relation to the typical opponents we've had promoting peace and climate justice and economic justice. And those are the neoconservatives and the neoliberals. Let me go into those for a few minutes in just a moment. There are oppositional forces, the social democratic forces, very little of the Swedish tradition still to be found out there, but a multipolarism that I want to spend a bit of time interrogating. I think it's a problem, the promotion of BRICS, and then the non-polar, which I think are the progressive forces here in this room, the independent left. A third area that we could quickly touch on, because I don't have much to add to what you know about Ukraine, but we have studied Israel's genocide and how we address it, and some of the stumbling blocks, even now as peace, at least a ceasefire, maybe a momentary pause, gets underway on Sunday. And that brings us to the difficulty of managing global crises. This year, South Africa hosts the G20, so we're doing a series of events, and certainly there'll be major protests, including against the new US Foreign Minister, Marco Rubio, in February, and all of the others. The BRICS are hosted last year in Russia, the year before in South Africa, and this year in Brazil, and we're watching that closely. The World Economic Forum is next week in Davos, and the climate negotiations. And there are a lot of other processes within the multilateral institutions, and especially more revelations from the global value chains, including for the laptop I'm using, the iPhones you might be using that we now know much more about because of the origins of some of the surplus value and the raw materials, the non-renewable resources in the Eastern DRC, which are now coming under question in the French and Belgian courts because the DRC government's attacking Apple there for looting the Eastern DRC. And the BRICS, I'm going to argue, are not our friends in these global value chains. They're not anti-imperialists, they're sub-imperialists. And that brings us finally to the climate question, because once again, as we saw in the Baku United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, Conference of Polluters, Conference of Parties, let's get that wrong, the Conference of Parties 29, and that will shift to Brazil, one of the BRICS, with the Amazon, the Belém-hosted COP30 this year. So we're watching all of these interact, partly because South Africa's had this role as the main African rep within this circuitry of advanced Western capital. Barack Obama moving from Oslo, where he got the Nobel Prize in December 2009, the next day, barging in on a meeting in the Bella Center in Copenhagen, where he found Lula da Silva, Wen Jiabao, Manmohan Singh, and South Africa's President Jacob Zuma. And that's, I'm going to argue, the basis for imperialist and sub-imperialist connectivity, a very difficult situation that I think encourages us not to simply say North and South, but to have more nuance. The reason is that the BRICS tend to be, and increasingly, what with new members that are very carbon intensive, Indonesia, for example, just joining 2 weeks ago as a full member, plus some of the new partners. And when you put them together as the, let's say, major emitters historically, as well as at present, even when you do per person, we can find the block that argues, I'll try to make this case, that emissions cuts should not occur and fossil fuels should not be phased down or phased out at the level we're going to need to save the planet. And secondly, that none of these men at the table ever had anything to do with any historic emissions. There are no historic emissions, and therefore there's no polluter pays. In other words, there's no liability, no climate debt, no reparations. That's the second of the agreements that effectively unite the West and the BRICS. The third is to privatize the air, by which I mean the carbon markets, the emissions trading scheme in Europe and varieties around the world, including in the BRICS. Now, first, the ideologies. There's a paleoconservatism that is now dominant. I hate to say that. I mean, I'm sure you know it very well from the rise of the right in Sweden, but a populist nationalism, especially because not only in the US, but Steve Bannon, the theorist and practitioner of this politics, has worked very effectively in Europe. And he has obviously friends in places like Argentina and a big bloc in Brazil that until 2003 ran the state under Jair Bolsonaro, as well as places like the Philippines and well, many others coming up as far-right sites. And Europe is most disturbing. J.D. Vance being the next generation. Trump having some disputes internally because he's allowed Steve Bannon to go against someone from Johannesburg, who's very, very important, Elon Musk, on this question of populist nationalism, which is going to be xenophobic and racist, protectionist, isolationist, against what Musk wants is to continue some of the international big data and techno-feudalism projects. But it brings us to a second traditional approach to imperial ideology, the neoconservatism, the warmongering of classical imperialism that particularly became very, very self-confident after the 9/11 attack on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon in New York and Washington. And then George W. Bush and his main ally there, Dick Cheney, pushed forward this neocon agenda of bringing democracy everywhere by the barrel of a gun in Iran and Iraq and Afghanistan, Libya, being utterly destroyed in the process. That banner has been carried in the Senate as much as anyone by the new Secretary of State, the U.S. Foreign Minister, Marco Rubio. Netanyahu obviously carries this. The main theorist, and he had a space at the table in the Trump regime, John Bolton, is now on the sidelines, but that's the ideology that I think we'd be concerned with. And if you say the neocons, which have very, very important roles in the Biden State Department with the outgoing Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, and especially his assistant until last year, Victoria Nuland. That was one of the reasons why we couldn't see any progress until this week on the ceasefire, and Trump comes in to shake things up a bit, to change the balance of forces, and hence at least temporary ceasefire. The traditional route of these, let's say, global elites has been since the early 90s, maybe the even 1980s, where there is no alternative of Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan and Paul Volcker's monetarism, Helmut Kohl, and this neoliberal attracted the likes of the Tony Blairs and many of the Labour Party and Social Democratic Party leaders of the 90s. Bill Clinton, for example, pushing it forward as hard as anyone. Big tech now driving it, the EU and UK being sites of neoliberalism. There is a notional social democratic agenda, and they're mostly proposals that you find in a sort of terrain of, Yanis Varoufakis to reform international circuits with his progressive international. Even the old Socialist International may call for some of these reforms, but they're not getting very far. And the real momentum is with those promoting Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, the BRICS, with the new members in 2023 in Johannesburg, the new members being Iran and UAE, Egypt, and Ethiopia. And Saudi Arabia was invited and went to the meetings last year, but didn't quite join, and now seems, with the Trump regime in power, to be pulling back and is replaced by Indonesia. And there are another 8 members that have, not become members, partners, and another 4 that may join. Among them are Turkey, Nigeria, Vietnam, and Algeria. But currently a large collection from West Asia and the sort of Central Asia. And then finally a 6th ideology, which I think is in the House today, the globalization of people against the globalization of capital, the old slogan that we had from Seattle days of trying to put a limit to corporate power at the global scale. Doing so with social movement linkages and anti-apartheid movement. We fought very hard, especially in South Africa, for medicines to become global public goods, and the AIDS struggle to get the antiretroviral drugs, ARVs, as non-intellectual property and non-commodified, that is given out free, made in countries like Uganda and Zimbabwe and South Africa, not in New Jersey or in Switzerland or in Germany, and given out by the state. And the result was our life expectancy in South Africa went from 52 to 65. Out of 60 million people, about 7 million living with HIV are getting these medicines. And this has raised, as I say, life expectancy from 52 at the low point in 2004 to 65, probably our greatest victory since the end of apartheid. COVID medicines, the vaccines, the treatment, we attempted the same project, but we had very, very few troops on the ground during the lockdowns. And even though Cyril Ramaphosa, the South African president, Narendra Modi from India led that struggle, they failed. And the particularly pernicious role of your neighbor, Norway, as well as Switzerland, but especially Angela Merkel here in Berlin and Boris Johnson in London were the most important forces in basically negating. But even the head of the WTO, who's a Nigerian, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, she was no use to us. Labor internationalism is weak at the moment. The global justice movement can be found here and there. A new pink tide from Latin America of progressive governments, the most impressive being Colombia and Mexico. Now, 2020 saw the Black Lives Matter, which had its resonances in places around the world like Nigeria, but the US had its biggest social movement explosion ever in mid-2020, even during COVID. And the two that are most robust at the moment, Palestine solidarity, I don't think this ceasefire will lead to a loss of momentum or some sort of relief that the problem is solved by no means, because Israel will, with Trump's permission, quite logically proceed to try to kick out as many people from the West Bank as they can and take more of the West Bank. And possibly a war against Iran looms. That's certainly Netanyahu's agenda, and the people around Trump would like to do so. And then we have climate justice, which I'll come back to. Now, Trump is in the news of attacking BRICS, particularly because of the potential the BRICS have for a de-dollarization. That is to say, that the Russians have been kicked out of the SWIFT, the Brussels-based payment systems that allow banks to talk to each other and trade. And the BRICS are not necessarily going to go anywhere with a new currency. That's been discussed, especially in the Johannesburg meeting, but also in the Kazan summit last October. And you see from the rhetoric that Trump issued on December 1 that he's looking to have some sort of ideological battle. But it's more than that. The power of the US dollar isn't simply in exchange relations, the SWIFT system. It's not simply in its use in the Bretton Woods institutions as a central vehicle for lending. It's also the quantitative easing, that is printing money from the US Federal Reserve, or from 2022, raising interest rates to very high levels, causing massive chaos, like massive debt crises in places like Egypt and Ethiopia and Zambia and Ghana, places that had been very high growth areas in the 2010s, going into debt crises today. Now, that is the ultimate strength, I think, of a dollar, is the ability of the US Fed to print, to bail out its own banks, and then to impose its own agenda of printing money and having US financial institutions have overweight power across the world. We've had a little cartoon from our greatest cartoonist maybe in the world, named Zapiro, to reflect that when this announcement came out on December 1, it led to panic in the BRICS, and taking over the G20 leadership for 2025, with Donald Trump scheduled to take over in 2026, Cyril Ramaphosa calls him up and says, I'm one of those shithole country presidents, but I'm calling on behalf of the BRICS. You don't need to put on 100% tariffs. We have no intention of starting a new currency to undermine the dollar, I assure you. And indeed, that was the repetitive statement, even from Vladimir Putin and from the Indian leadership. We hold the dollar in high regard, which reflects that he's quite a corrupt man, our president, who keeps dollars stashed in couches in one of the major scandals. The BRICS are just too weak, and the Chinese and Indians, who have the strongest potential, 1.4 billion population in each country, but the Chinese, especially with the yuan and the renminbi, the Indians with their rupee, keep strong exchange controls as their states try to keep at least some grip on their capitalist classes. They would lose their exchange controls as they internationalize their currency, and I just don't think it's going to happen. I think the limits of the trade relations that are going to be based on South-South currency or intra-BRICS currency, a BRICS pay system, those limits are in the trade deficits and surpluses that the different BRICS countries have. India, for example, in a huge deficit with Russia because it imported so much energy. I'll be very quick to wrap up now, but I just wanted you to have a sense before I conclude with climate of how contradictory things are. When Benjamin Netanyahu in September gave his big talk at the UN General Assembly, the summit where the leaders speak, he pulled out this chart. On it were 4 of the existing BRICS. As I say, Saudi Arabia has begun to drop out, or its application, its potential membership, which was approved, is now so-called frozen. But you can see India and UAE and Saudi Arabia and Egypt as the blessers of Netanyahu. And that's partly because of this relationship to go around the Houthi blockage of the Red Sea. But it's a broader relationship. Even South Africa, which took Saudi Arabia to the International Court of Justice to claim genocide, is part and parcel of this. And I could go through, as I've done in a lot of my recent research, all the ways that the BRICS countries, even those 5 original ones, plus some of the new ones, are indeed economically profiting from the genocide through, for example, South Africa being a leading coal supplier, and Russia as well. Now, if we go to those fossil fuels, you'll see that the original BRICS plus the expanded BRICS, now Indonesia would take the place of Saudi Arabia. I'll have to update this chart, but basically 51% of annual CO2 emissions while producing only 29% of GDP. That's not corrected for purchasing power parity, but I think it's a fair kind of comparison. It's what capitalists think of as their output. So it's a vastly carbon addicted network, the BRICS. And when you look at the G20 as we do, sorry, Zapiro comes up again in this sort of emissions map of the G20, sort of who's going to stop these guys? They are so addicted, and they're structurally connected to each other in the UNFCCC. There's only one African, although the AU was added in 2023. So I'll finish with these 3 points. The objective of the BRICS and the West in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is not to cut emissions to the extent we need to save us from planetary catastrophe. And we have to keep calling them out on especially the deal that was done in Copenhagen, the so-called bottom-up voluntary approach, because it has no enforcement mechanisms, no way to ensure accountability. Donald Trump on Monday, but maybe Tuesday or Wednesday, will drop out of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and basically allow all his own companies to increase emission. You might have noticed the 6 biggest banks in the US, plus the big institutional investors like BlackRock, have now dropped their own non-fossil fuel commitments. And then there's going to be lots more drilling from the US in their national parklands and offshore. So what have we got? And I ask you this with the respect I know Swedes have as the most important supporters of anti-apartheid sanctions. Can we do a BDS USA, a boycott, divestment, sanctions against US products? As outlandish as you might think, that's the suggestion from Naomi Klein and even from Nicolas Sarkozy, the corrupt former conservative French president, and from Joe Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize laureate. And that is maybe the kinds of politics that we're going to see a year from now, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM, where you and Sweden and the rest of Europe will put on tariffs against high emissions embedded products coming into Europe. That needs to be the first order of the day for dealing with Donald Trump, or something similar, something to delegitimize the US state. The question of the climate debt is a fascinating one, and it is, again, where the West and the BRICS come together. And we have to continue to remind, especially in a country like South Africa, where the beneficiaries of the climate debt, that is the emissions over roughly a century, when got very deep into mining and smelting, having the 3rd highest emissions per person per unit of output behind Kazakhstan and the Czech Republic, right? The 3rd highest in the world. Those are white beneficiaries, rich beneficiaries. They are extractive industries which never compensate for the depleted non-renewable wealth they've taken. And they're mostly multinational corporates headquartered abroad. So pushing them that they have a liability. The BRICS, yes, should also be contributing to all of these financing mechanisms, and hopefully we get them reformed one day. They're run by places like World Bank, very useless at the moment, but obviously a north to south strategy for climate. The one I recommend is something that the evangelical church, the Lutheran church in Germany, a progressive church, has got with Namibia, which is a place called Ochivero, where they give everyone, at least they did in the pilot, a grant. And the Swedes have also been very interested in, historically, a place in Ecuador, the Yasuni Park, to pay the Ecuadorian government to leave the oil underground. And that's something now being called a Just Energy Transition Partnership. That would be a vehicle to start paying climate debt once we can get more progressive control. And the final point, this privatization of the EU emissions trading scheme is chaos. I should show you my graphs, but basically you can find the pricing of carbon at chaotic levels. Sweden is the greatest price at around 120 euros, I think it is at the moment. The EU emissions trading scheme is below 70. It was as high as 110 in February 2023. So it's a bit of a casino. I think I'll end there, but it's just to say we have a group, the Durban Group for Climate Justice, meeting on Sunday. And those of you interested in trying to roll back the carbon pricing that takes the form of an emissions trading scheme, a casino in which we've asked the banks to solve the problem of the climate crisis. How crazy is that? If we want to stop that, well, we need the sorts of carbon taxes that you've explored in Sweden probably as much as anyone. I hope that gives you a bit of a sense of how I'm seeing the chaos out there. I've written a piece last week in ZNet, Z-N-E-T, and I'll pass that along to Jorden. You can perhaps think about whether my arguments about the way in which our geopolitical chaos, our climate chaos, and our multilateral malgovernance all need the kind of left critique that I always look to from all of you comrades in Sweden. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Patrick. We'll just wait a moment for see if there's any questions. There's nothing coming on the chat yet, but I was just wondering, both BRICS and, well, I mean, everybody, all countries are carbon addicted. You mentioned specifically that the BRICS countries were as well. But the carbon addiction and the increased emissions require continued availability of cheap energy. I wonder, in your research, have you looked about sort of the energy availability and you know the probability, the likelihood of a lower carbon economical future, and in particular the fact that the fracking that's gone on in North America, they're going to the steep decline that is noted after fracking wells reach their peak. It's going to kind of force everything to a grinding halt. Have you looked at that at all in your research?
Yes, I see. For some reason, my internet here in Berlin is a little chaotic. I'm not sure if these.
It might be us actually. I noticed that everybody froze
before. Might be, okay. Okay. So I'd be happy to answer quickly, but are there others that want to add to that? The questions of how, especially a just transition can occur, because we work on it all the time. Anybody else in that same spirit? I mean, the dilemma is that the unit costs of solar and wind are lower than building new coal-fired power plants. The existing coal-fired power plants, which provide about 90% of a country like South Africa that's very carbon addicted, but there are many others that are in the same situation. They've got sunk investments that mean they've paid off their capital, and so they're just running on the marginal costs, the operating costs. For new construction, there's just no question that solar and wind are going to be cheaper. But it is this dilemma as how do we pay countries like South Africa, but especially the countries that have large fossil fuel resources that are now being extracted. The one next door to South Africa, Mozambique, which has just had yet another terrible cyclone. I see my friend Hans in the room who will maybe still hopefully staying in close touch with the Mozambicans. They're having a social rebellion against the corrupt ruling party. But the big question for them is how do we get them not to extract their gas in the north? A place called Cabo Delgado, where Total Energies, ExxonMobil, National Petroleum, BP, and Eni, the Italians, are all trying to suck out what's the third biggest gas field in the world after Qatar and one in Russia. So that's the kind of struggle I think this Just Energy Transition Partnership needs Swedish advocacy from the base. That is, we need to pay Mozambique to leave the fuel underground. Leave fossil fuels underground is our motto. Now, South Africa started that with a pilot. The Swedes haven't contributed as far as I know, but the Danes have, and the Germans and the French and Brussels, the EU, the UK and US, the Just Energy Transition Partnership. So there should be a carrot. Let me say the carrot should be much more generous. It should be not as loans, but as grants. There should be a stick because South Africa's fossil addiction is so severe that the president of South Africa is a coal mining tycoon. His name, Cyril Ramaphosa. His brother-in-law, Patrice Motsepe, works with Glencore, 50-50% deal to export coal to Israel, right? So we're having protests at the brother-in-law's place too. These coal addicts, they need to have a stick, not just a carrot. What kind of a stick? I think the tariffs. Since we're seeing this move to protectionism, sure, it's racist and xenophobic. It comes from the worst elements in your societies. But I think we should be turning that towards the counting of the emissions, and that is the implicit fossil fuel subsidies. And there we change the price ratios as to not just the new construction, where we need to have much more of the solar, and certainly China's overproducing, as they say. It's hard to think of overcapacity when we need solar and wind so badly. We need electric vehicles and batteries so badly. And so the European and US attacks on China for overproducing, these just make no sense. They're only in the mind of a capitalist to say you're overproducing. But I think the main thing then is to find this combination of carrots and sticks that we as progressive advocates can support. The one I mentioned is the attempt to give a climate debt payment, both to Namibia, to the people affected by climate change in Ochevero, and the Yasuni project in Ecuador. To me, those are the optimal ways of doing the kinds of solidaristic work that this group here is well known for. But I'd love to hear what you would like to propose there. And I think particularly a degrowth for the North and for the wealthy in the South, people in the middle class like myself in Johannesburg, in the global North. We should be doing a rethinking of the consumption norms and patterns. And one of the interesting groups that I'm embarrassed because I'm saying this from Berlin, but it's Stay Grounded. And their efforts are to do things like stop frequent flyer programs and to tax frequent flyers. And those are the sorts of things that begin to hit at the privileges of the rich. Instead of a carbon tax that alienates people like, the yellow vests in France or the Ecuadorian peasants who were hit with high petrol increases because of carbon taxes and then revolted and became climate denialists. So those to me are some of the challenges that we're going to have, is to build justice in so that our climate action doesn't get undermined by injustices, and we have a climate justice movement again. And you're such a great young woman who can link these issues. I don't see Greta Thunberg in the house today, but I'm sure you're doing your best to pick up on that wonderful energy she's given us.
Yes, she's always reinventing herself. Well, interesting thoughts there, Patrick. Perhaps linking degrowth to the BDS USA campaign. But we'll say thank you to you for now, and there'll be more chance to ask Patrick questions.
And Eva just asked about Rubio, and I must admit I didn't watch it. So Eva, I hope you can talk about what you think's happening. And I don't know enough about Ukraine. I'd love Boris Kagarlitsky to be in the room, but he's in jail. Our dear friend, some of you know Boris, put in jail for 5 years for telling a joke about a cat. You're obviously anti-war. So we'll listen in. If I go offline, it's only off the video, but I'd love to stay with you on audio all night. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, you're welcome to stay until 6 o'clock at least, please. Anuradha Chenoy, welcome to the stage. And Anuradha is adjunct professor at the School of International Affairs in the Jindal Global University in India, and active in the International Peace Bureau. I'll be honest, Anuradha, I don't know that much more about you. If you'd like to say a few words about yourself that you think are relevant for our audience this evening.
Well, that's about, yeah. Well, thank you for having me. And I've essentially been an academic for the better part of my life, almost 35, 40 years. First, I was in a university called Jawaharlal Nehru University, which is now in shambles thanks to our ethno-nationalist majoritarian government, which couldn't stand that university. Then I retired from there, and I'm at this private Jindal University, and I've always, for years, been associated with the peace and social movements, but of course, not like many of you as full-time, but I work for them whenever they want something written or any kind of thinking work. So that's about it. So I will share my screen.
Yes.
And
that was at the, yeah.
Brilliant. Yeah. Okay. It's actually happened. Okay. So Todd actually, who's a friend, and I keep engaging with him at various peace groups, asked me to speak on this kind of intersection between between climate and peace activists, and I think that's a very, very important intersection. In fact, I would add also the women's movement to it eventually. And I would also like to thank Patrick for having said so much on climate and making my tasks so much easier, because on climate, I largely agree with him. I have a few differences on the issue of the geopolitics of BRICS in a nuanced way, which I will go into later. But first, about why I'm arguing that the climate and peace groups should at least have a similar paradigm or refer to each other all the time. And I'm going to do 2 or 3 case studies to show why it matters. The first is about India, Pakistan, and China. You know, there's a frozen conflict, or sometimes it gets a hot conflict, sometimes it's frozen, but it's unresolved. One between India and Pakistan, and the other is between India and China. Which makes these fabulous Himalayas the largest and highest chain of mountains into the highest militarized zone in the world, where India and Pakistan have been have faced off since 1984, even though sometimes there's a ceasefire, and India and China also. And this costs each of them $200 to $300 million a year just to maintain their soldiers, their military on the borders, and sometimes $60 million a day. And this actually contributes to up to 50% of climate change effect in the Himalayas, according to our own scientists. And with all this movement in these high peaks, there's this black carbon and CO2 emissions from vehicles alone, from the drones and from the base camps to the mountains. This can, of course, decrease with reduced vehicular movement, but actually it can only decrease if there's some peace. Now, the Indian Army, for example, operates at this highest point of the Siachen Glacier, 20,000 feet above the sea, and it's called the Strategic Defensive Border, and the Pakistani army is also close by, as are the Chinese. And there's a glacial meltdown that flows into the river Indus, which is a lifeline for millions in the entire subcontinent, both in India and Pakistan. So then there are no ways of bringing the waste back from all these troops who are deployed here. So there's also mountain trash, which is like 2,000 pounds of waste a day, which is dumped into the glaciers, into the crevices every day, along with the high artillery waste, serious water pollution for the, which I've just mentioned. And the distance from the glacier to the base camp takes 4 days of climbing. So more soldiers have died of frostbite than even the wars and the conflicts out there. Now, of course, India, because of the international pressure and others, they have had some targets, but there's very little attempt to actually relate the ecological costs or the climate issues with militarization and with war. So while our climate movement and the scientists are talking about, targets, etc., yet the military expenditure, as Patrick mentioned, keeps rising, and the emissions also. Similarly, there's a great love for nuclear power, especially amongst all the countries of, I always speak on behalf of the Global South, but the elites of the Global South are in love with nuclear power now, and they want to have more and more nuclear power stations, and whenever there have been protests against it, they have been very badly clamped down. And even when some of the South Asian and other South countries are in debt, what are they doing? They're handing over their facilities to the military. So, for example, in Pakistan, there were recent floods. The government couldn't, very bad floods related to climate change in Sindh. The government institutions could not cope, so they handed it to the military. In Sri Lanka, I mean, even something like a football stadium, they couldn't cope with, and they handed it to the military. So there's a great amount of militarization in all of South Asia, in all of the South and South Asia. The second is of course a case is about Gaza and the humanitarian hellscape out there, as the UN Secretary General has said. If you see the latest UN Environment Program report, the environmental impact of the conflict in Gaza, so simultaneous with the genocide, there is also, I don't know how you want to call it, an environmental side or eco side and cultural side. So there are many sides in this, where these 85,000 tons of explosives equal to almost 3 nuclear bombs, the white phosphorus, etc., have really destroyed Gaza. This is something everyone knows, even though many of, including in the global South, just like in the US, you're no longer really allowed to talk about it in the mainstream media. This just comes from the alternate sources, because all governments are under pressure, especially from the West, to not talk about Gaza. But this unprecedented intensity of conflict-related damage is so huge that this entire region, the livestock, the agriculture, the soil, the trees, birds, food, secure, everything has been badly damaged. So again, what I'm pleading for is that the peace movements, the movements for Palestine also talk about both the environment as well, and show the links between this, which is not there in any mainstream paradigm. Then, of course, the US as the greatest polluter, I think, again, this has been shown by Patrick, and it's probably common knowledge, where the military-industrial complex are the largest institutional consumers of fossil fuels, and the amount of billions of metric tons of greenhouse gases they emit. And there was a wonderful study by the Transnational Institute which shows that the richest nations are still spending 30 times as much on the military as on climate finance. There is no evidence that the military can reduce emissions. And instead of providing climate finance, the richest countries are selling arms to the climate vulnerable nations, fueling conflict, instability as extreme weather gets worse. Then third, I also want to link how this militarization is impacting the women, and how the women's movement must also, see this intersection, especially in the global South, where this militarization is setting back the gains made from the women's movement. And here I've just shown a poster during 9/11, which was common in all of the global South, which actually showed that, that our leaders, if they don't take up arms, if they don't fight like Osama bin Laden here did, they become like women. And this is continuously there, that if we don't protect our borders, if we don't continue protecting the line of control, either between India or Pakistan or India and China, the leadership gets feminized. So it's really, all this militarization is a huge setback continuously for women in all of the global South. I've just given this as a case, but I've seen this across. So really, this is just my kind of concluding table, which shows the priorities of the government on climate and on war is very similar. There is, a kind of a neoliberal corporate preference, a priority for growth and profit over environment, just like there is a priority for the military and defense and oil industry over social expenditure and climate finance, while the activists are asking for protection, implementation of environment laws, and the people are the ones who suffer this, and the impact is very severe in the entire global South. Then the interest groups are primarily these transnational corporations, the extractives, the oil majors, and for the as far as the climate is concerned, similarly the military-industrial complex. Whereas the activists, and I would say that through the global South, and especially these days in India, the activists and social groups are being marginalized. Democracy is being hollowed out, threatened. There are a lot of activists in jail. Their funding has been removed. There's an attempt to break the link between the activists of the global South with the North, so that the paradigm shift does not take place. So they are continuously silenced, questioned, outlawed. So there is a complete corporate regime nexus for this kind of pattern of growth, and the refusal to link peace with climate. And we could see that during COVID. So ultimately, the women's movement and other movements continue to push for this, despite the odds despite the odds against them. And now, just one last point, I would talk about my slight difference with Patrick on the issue of BRICS, because knowing how hard, I do agree with a lot on what he said about climate completely, and the BRICS, and the fact that, they're not taking sufficient measures. But as a voice of the global South, there are contradictions between them and the real major imperialists, especially the United States. And even when they try and, if I can use that word, suck up to the United States, there are still contradictions, and they still try to have some amount of strategic autonomy, where they balance between the imperial North with others in order to be able to have some development and legitimacy. That is the way that India has been able to come out of its very low income status, as has China. Of course, they're also sub-imperial to some extent, but nobody in the South has been hegemonic or had the same kind of colonialism as the West. So I still feel there is some nuances, and we in the social movements do not have the strength to fight our own government, leave alone imperialism. And that's where I find some usefulness and importance in multipolarity and BRICS. But otherwise, I agree with what Patrick said. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anuradha. We've got a comment and a question coming on the chat. Thanks a million, Anu, for a brilliant presentation, says Ulla Klutzer from Women for Peace Finland. And Eva Berglund asks, I heard that there was an agreement between India and China at the Kazan meeting that might stop the confrontations at the border. What do you think about that?
This is exactly what I mean by the crevices in between where these governments can work, because there was so much pressure on India. And mind you, I'm not pro the Indian government, as you might know. I've had my pension cut. I don't have that pension because of the comments I've made about the Indian government. But what happened is that the United States has been, the last 4 years through the Biden regime, have put pressure on India that China, if they attack you, we are the only ones who can help, and you should have a stronger military strategic alliance with the United States. India already gave in and has a logistic exchange memorandum where the American ships can come and dock, but that's it. So they don't want to go any further, and they put this Chinese threat. But what India has said back openly, repeatedly, is that we will have our own bilateral engagement with China. And there have been 43 rounds of commander level talks on the border. Until 2018, it was quiet. Then China, got 50,000 troops on the border, and there were 2 conflagrations in 2018 and 2020, and complete freeze in relationships. These border talks continued at the commander level, and now there has been a political will and attempt to disengage, because I think both China and India have realized that they cannot go with the United States for everything. They betray the global South repeatedly. So they have had this disengagement. About 80% of the border post issues have been kind of not resolved, but there's now, it's instead of resolution, it's conflict management. They're disengaged from these sides. Some of the villages will be like a buffer zone, and this is ongoing. So they've done it on their own without the United States intervention. And people like us were really nervous that India would completely, just like what's happened with NATO and many of the countries in Southeast Asia, like South Korea and Philippines, is that the US now has a lattice-like agreements with all of them. And they've become the new proxies, just like who would be able to confront China. As you know, China has, the United States does not have the strategic depth to be able to have a war with China. China has an edge, even while they're talking about a war. And many of their generals have said by 2025, we can have a war. And China is also clear that that Taiwan is a province in China, and they will try to peacefully take it, but it can blow up. So India has been at the center of all this, but they have kind of, I think, very clearly decided that they would not like to be part of either a proxy for the US. They would like to strategically engage with the US, with the Russians, and have decent relations with the Chinese. So China is a major trading partner now of India. And there's a lot happening on the border for disengagement, not peace, but conflict management and disengagement, so that it doesn't, this wound doesn't fester again. So similarly, with Pakistan, there's a freeze, but India believes that Pakistan now is faced with so many issues. They renegotiated their debt with the World Bank 23rd time. There's a conflict now with the Afghanistan Taliban over that border. They have a problem with their border on Iran. They have a problem with the border with India. So India seems to be in a much stronger position, but there's no resolution of the border issue on that either. So it is a tense situation, but again, like all of you activists, I believe that if we have peace, if we are anti-hegemonic, anti-imperial, it would be overall better for climate. And as far as the last COP29 was concerned, I think most of the people in the global south felt it was a betrayal because the original treaty was overturned, and the third world has been told really to look out for themselves, because that climate finance, as they talked about, looks like an illusion. So that's where I'll end on that question. Thank you. Sorry for taking up so much time.
No, that's fine. That's great. Actually, I've got another question for you. What's the current temperature? You know, you said yourself that you've had economic difficulties. Your pension has been cut for comments that you've made. But what's the temperature and the direction of activism in India at the moment? Are people coming out on the streets? You know, what's happening and what's being planned that you know of?
Yeah. I'm quite familiar with all this.
Yeah.
You know, what activism has really worked fantastically has been the farmers' movement, because the government could not cope, one, with the numbers, the kind of resistance. It was directly against corporatization of agriculture. And they also form a voting constituency, the Jats and the Punjabi farmers, etc. But as far as individual small groups are concerned, like let's say those who protested against the Kudankulam plant, nuclear plant, or those who, the others, if you cannot really criticize government policies and this ethnic majoritarianism. They target you in a whole lot of ways. So there's complete lawfare. They'll put cases against you. You would get dismissed from your position. There are students of ours who were active against the citizenship laws, and they've been in jail like for 4 years, and the trial hasn't begun. Someone as popular like Arundhati Roy, they have just opened a case against her, and they're going to start proceedings. So they keep this Damocles sword over your head. And students, the student movement has been squashed. They have their own militia, so they can be quite violent. So everyone's really under threat. And the other thing is, the sad thing is that the organized left, they have really not been able, they have declined to such an extent that all we hear from them are some statements, as opposed, we don't see any street action. The trade unions sometimes do, some action, not much, but they've not really been able to confront the kind of crude capitalism which is now developing in India. But on the other side, the thing is that India, it's extremely unequal now, but the middle class and the rich are really moving ahead quite fast. And today I saw some new statistics where, for example, the number of women in the workforce in the last few years has dramatically risen, which is a good sign. It also means that people have to do 2 jobs to survive, but it also empowers them, which I feel is a good thing. That's the only sort of semi-decent thing which has come out, the only decent statistic I've seen in the last couple of years. So that's the state. The state of the movements is not great, but the farmers' movement was indeed very... but you see, some of the alternate media which covered them, they took away their funding, and they were in jail for 2 years. Just the alternate media for having covered the farmers' protest.
Are the farmers still active in their protests? You said you used the past tense there.
Well, they went back, but they've started again because the government promised the minimum support prices. And they said this should be legislated, which they did not. So their leader is on hunger fast unto death, and the government has blockaded wherever they were coming in to the capital. They're not allowed to come in, but you keep hearing that they keep having some action or the other. So it's not dead in a sense, and it can rise again. And since they have a large constituency, the government keeps doing some kind of small negotiation with them, then they withdraw, then they come back again. So it's like pressure, compromise, pressure tactics.
Okay. Thank you. I had another comment. Your talk was tremendously informative. Thank you for all that we have learned about the situation today. Are you able to stay with us until for another hour?
Yes, I will.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much, Anuradha Shenoy. Oh, Leo Gabriel, we haven't heard from you yet today. Can we hear a word? Make sure your mic is working.
Hello.
Hello. Marvelous. And you're active with the World Social Forum.
Yes. I was sort of a co-founder of the World Social Forum. Like many initiatives, I like to be when things are triggered off, and I leave them when they are sort of on the run, and in order to avoid the decay of them. Yeah. I'm very pleased to be here in touch with a part of the world I know so little, the north of Europe. I know more about Latin America, where I've been living for 30 years, and Africa also. So I have to correct that, and perhaps this would be a good beginning. Well, in terms provocative, I want to start to say that we should remember 2025 as the year of the beginning of the end of globalization. At least in the terms that the neoliberals have called it, because they lost now everything, and wherever you look in Europe, in Latin America, in the United States, everywhere, they lost the shame to directly interfere, and they want to be outspoken fundamentalists. The Russians, it's very interesting, the Russian economists don't talk about neoliberalism, they talk about free market fundamentalism, which I find much more precise, especially at this point of the game and of history, where we see emerging between the classical rule of the rich all around the world, different oligarchs, and there is no difference between oligarch in the United States or in Russia or whatever, and the far right, which is under this name mainly talked about in Europe. I'm coming from a very small country, Austria, and we just had elections, and we, according to circumstances, those parties who have said that they won't make coalition with the far right finally withdrew, and now we have a chance. We're going to have a chancellor, head of government for the first time from the far right. What do they do? For instance, when Assad government in Syria fell down, the first thing they said is, now, starting with the day of tomorrow, all Syrians in Austria, there are quite a lot of refugees, all Syrians have to go back to their country because we don't want to see them anymore. There are others, for instance, now it's a news of today, they are discussing about the budget. And the only things they are scratching in order to fill the debt are the things that the Green have promoted in terms of climate change, in terms of ecological measures. All the projects will be cut as a matter of principle. We don't want them anymore. They are too annoying. All that means that our hope, which we had, at least me, for decades, that in some way our movements could count on the goodwill of the nation states, of the governments, as a sort, at least an intermediary between the poor and the rich, and the whole polarized society. All that, I think we have to forget about that. We are in a new age where civil society directly has to confront this superstructure on the national level and on the international level. And that is not a very easy task. So some people in the left think that because this monopolar world is somehow breaking up in different regions and so on. We have talked about BRICS and so on, the multipolar world, that is the alternative. And we have to get them to support our things, and then everything will be forceful. And there I am a little bit more on the side of Patrick. It is, I mean, if we look at China, what about the minorities in China? What about the women in Iran? What about the military and the oligarchy in Russia, Turkey? Name it who it is of these various poles of power. That is not our game. So there are many people who end up, and I know them personally, by having a sort of a nervous breakdown because they think it doesn't make sense to do anything anymore because the overarching superstructures are that strong and powerful that it's only for personal satisfaction that we are doing these movements. But I think, and they think often that, and they look a little bit like the people who, you know, if somebody gets drowned in the sea and there is one who can swim, the one who gets drowned tears the one who can swim apart. That there could be a dynamic like that. I'm a social anthropologist. I have known cultures where that happened. But I think that there is a third possibility. Since, let's say, 3, 4, 5 decades, we have been, and I say we because I think that all of us have been involved in trying to design alternatives within social movements, NGOs, whatever. And these alternatives are have a very, very important base. Perhaps we have already reached a little advantage. That means that several things which I remember when I was young, we were small groups and really marginal from the marginal. And now at least the subject matters. What we discuss is getting part of the mainstream, and also mainstream media, as long as they still exist in an independent way, but that's another question. We have reached in several fields, in economy, the solidarity economy, the many different projects against the pollution, the destruction of our planet, and there are also very practical endeavors which have been done. The peasants, I mean, look, Via Campesina and all this, they realized a lot of things. But one thing is missing. When let's say the environmental movement came up, they were the first, I think, to say we have to think globally and act locally. That was good for a time where we had the hope that one day the political frame will change, the states, the governments, and so on, will move to our direction. But as I said, I don't believe that. That's to say, we have to ask, how can we act globally? Not only think globally. And there is the value. I don't want to make a big propaganda show, but there is the value in principle. In reality, it's different, but in principle of an organization like the World Social Forum. Because it's not only a gathering for this subject, alternative economics, against wars and for peace, and there everything is included, and the question is, how can we make out of these different goals, these different struggles, a common struggle? Because the peace movement alone will not be strong enough to stop the war. And the trade unions will not be enough to equalize in a just way our societies. And climate justice cannot be achieved only by the climate justice movement. But this is not a matter, as you could think, of organization in this way, that we need to have telephone numbers and we need to get together and talk. And it's not only that. It is more fundamental. We have to look at our own issue, where we have been dedicated for decades, in a way that it includes the other movements. And if every movement does that and has this conscious, and not only stick to my issue, then there could be evolving a force on a global level which has something we don't have at the present moment, that is called power. I know it's an ugly word, power. But all of what we have heard now about India and so on, the repression is mounting. It's always this power who destroys everything or most things we want. So we need a global instance where this can merge together. As we say, convergence is the most important thing strategically we have to do from now on, that neoliberal globalization is approaching its end. We can be the precursors. Perhaps we couldn't see it, but at least to put on track a convergence of movements, also of some parties. Why not? But the party is not the vanguard of this. Sometimes they are good, sometimes they are bad, you know what I mean. But they are integrating also as a link in this convergence. And I think that that will determine the future of the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Leo. If there's any questions from the audience, then please write them in the chat or put your hand up, or indeed just start speaking. Convergence and cross-movement support, Leo, you said was the way forward. What examples have you seen in your time with the World Social Forum, or even outside of that? What works best? How do we do that? Like, I'm from the transition movement, towards from the peace movement. We're sitting here in the same room. What other ways? I mean, apart from actually sort of arranging things like this, what works best that you've seen?
Because the problems are integrated. If you look, for instance, at the fact, I don't have the exact figure in my head, but you have this famous institute in Sweden who has every year gives a report, and they figured out that the militarization with the not only the wars, but the military bases, the conflicts, they are destroying, are the main polluters of the air, they say, more than any industry. And so, of course, also the armament industry belongs to that. So we need to stop these militarization processes, because if not, we can forget about climate justice. because whatever we achieve on the one hand will be covered by this immense machinery, transnational machinery of the warmongers. That is one example why we have, and on the other side too, I mean, without a clear vision that our planet is going to die, what can we do about the social movements? It's to fight for more salaries when everybody is going to disappear. That's so. From each coin, the women's movement is tremendously important in this. I mean, for all movements, not only for the women's movement, but that has to be pushed everywhere. If not, we end up like the left, who at certain times were more patriarchal and more chauvinistic and more machistic than the right many times. Do you remember? So there are, we need each other, not only physically, not only by strengths, no, by concept. We have to integrate concepts.
Thank you. I had a question from Eva and about social media, and what do you see as the role of social media, and perhaps should we be a bit wary of using it when we see that they can adjust the algorithms to promote certain content and not others? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, we have to use everything. There are horrible social media presenting fake news, especially those who are controlled by political forces in an indirect way. Yes, but we have also got to enter the arena and contradict them. And do what we can, because the mainstream media are becoming more and more under the pressure, economic pressure, so that the governments, especially the right-wing governments, which are going to grow, they hate them. So we need to go to an alternative in the social media in order to raise our voice.
May I comment a bit? May I?
Yes.
Please.
Yes, it was I who asked that, because in the beginning of this Gaza conflict, the latest one, I followed a lot of streams on the X platform, and I could hear directly from people in Gaza and the area discussing immediately about with another. I heard speeches of the late Nasrallah directly and translated and immediate discussion. It was amazing, and I think we really could reach out if we use those stream possibilities on the X platform. I don't know anyone where else where it's possible, but this was amazing, and they were allowed to just speak freely, the Gaza activists and everyone. I don't know if it has changed, but it was amazing at that time, at least.
Thank you.
The problem, I think, with social media is that they are so diverse. Of course, the X you are mentioning is a big one. But if we start now to make a small one, about certain issues which we feel that are important, well, it reaches certain amount of people, but they are so many that nobody can really bear his head unless he throws away his head and substitute it by artificial intelligence.
Thank you. I'm just asking Patrick if he can turn his video on. And Anuradha, you wanted to comment?
Yeah, no, I wanted to completely agree with what Eva said, because, for instance, in our mainstream media, we only got to know about Gaza from Reuters. They only had Reuters reports. So the real conversation of what was happening, and we saw the entire, whatever South Africa did in the International Court of Justice, we could see it because of alternate media on this X, on X. So it's very important, I think, and there was a lot of information, and they were able to challenge the mainstream media because there was such an effort from our own Islamophobic government. Our government is as Islamophobic and maybe more than that in the West. They just wanted to portray this as, some terrorists and the poor victims. And they were scared that our own minorities, the Muslims, might rise up. So they prohibited any, they didn't allow any demonstrations, but they got all the information. Mm. And they're very, very, thanks. So what I'm saying is that I agree with what Leo also said, that social media can be used. Of course, we can never be the dominant force even on social media, but it's a great way of connecting, and they're getting a lot. I see a lot of alternate media, even from the West, as a consequence. Even from Africa, from what happened in Niger and the coup and the conversations there, the Middle East. So I think that's a very important source. The only thing what I didn't agree fully with what Leo was saying, he's completely right that our own governments like Turkey or even wherever, it could be like Zambia, India, there's nothing that we can really link with. But at the same time, the people within those countries have to overthrow those. We cannot have intervention from the West as regime change or sanctions, because that's been thoroughly exposed as being highly hypocritical. The use of human rights and democracy or autocrats, when it suits whoever it suits them, they support those human rights violations. It suited them in Gaza, but it doesn't suit them in Niger or somewhere else. So we have to have our own movements within these countries to contest our own dictators. Thank you.
Thank you, Anuradha. Patrick.
Yeah, I think Anuradha's absolutely right. I want to call this movement, Anuradha, would you allow me, the R2PWW, the right to protect without Washington. And that's in a way what our international solidarity is all about, isn't it? And the work to do a BDS on Israel is crucial. And I would say, I would love to learn from you where you think our work ahead on solidarity with the Ukrainian working class being mass murdered, the Russian, oppressed, the anti-war movement there. I'd love to hear where that goes. I do have, since social media was raised, I do have to offer an apology from Johannesburg. We have a particularly wicked way of raising little white children, little boys. And you see that in Elon Musk. He was bullied in his high school in the bourgeois area of Johannesburg, Bryanston, and he was push down 2 flights of stairs. And he might have been a wonderful, smart little iconoclastic little genius. But a place like Johannesburg, the most unequal city in the world, in the most unequal country in the world, with what PwC, terrible consultancy, I always get that wrong. PwC has the economic crime and fraud survey, and Johannesburg is always #1, with a corporate elite that's white and corrupted. So I think we do not carbon offsets, but people offsets. We give you Trevor Noah, who's the greatest comedian and certainly greatest impersonator in the world. We give you Tyler, one of the great young singers. We give you Charlize Theron. I hope that offsets for Elon Musk a tiny bit. I hope you can go to Blue Sky and get rid of your X addiction. I hope you can find ways that your social media taps in our situation in the South African left. We're worried because the most important figure in controlling our speech is Mark Zuckerberg, because he owns Facebook and therefore WhatsApp, and WhatsApp is our organizing device. But sometimes, have you heard the phrase, this is like building your house on a platform above a trapdoor. The trapdoor goes, and this is what working with these big corporate, big data, techno-feudalist processes are all about. I think if there's one other aspect, probably Leo inspired me to remember the great days of the World Social Forum. And I want to offer this critique of the WSF, and I've written it up a little bit. You might know the name Jai Sen, the late Peter Waterman, Madharesh Kumar. We put a book together. We were warning in 2007 that the direction of a World Social Forum that had this middle layer, can I call that civilized society, would crowd out the uncivil society. I think you might remember, Anu, in Mumbai, they had in 2004 an alternative 10th platform for a World Social Forum for Uncivil Society. And those social movement mobilizations, and we think about those all around the world at the moment. The biggest one, MST from Brazil, the Movement of Landless Workers. I happened to be in Rio for this G20 to see if we can get some lessons. And it was a terrible defeat that we suffered, in the sense that the MST, the great radical social movement of the landless, the land invaders, plus the Kutch, the trade union movement in Brazil, and many of the other groups that were, let's say, left inclined, they were co-opted by Lula into the S20. So what I see in G20, which we're watching very closely in Johannesburg, because we're hosting in November, and even we're hosting Marco Rubio and David Lammy and all these others next week. But what I see is the propensity of a petty bourgeois layer to be co-opted or brought into, and this is really the leadership, into an elite project that talks left, but walks right, which is what I think Lula did at Rio G20 last November, and what I think he'll do in the BRICS in July in Rio, and what he'll do in the COP30 in Belém. And the strength of different left forces in countries. South Africa has 3: a centrist, let's call it a constitutionalist, left liberal force that doesn't like what government does because government's too neoliberal and destroys constitutional rights in the process. The case that's just happened this last week, Stilfontein, the death of 87 mine workers, a great example. The second left is the campist or multipolar left, which I think we're dealing with as we're all grappling with this. This is the biggest left around the world. Anu, it's a left in which the Tricontinental in Delhi, brilliant people there, brilliant output, prolific, most eloquent man, I think, working this beat, Vijay Prashad. But that's a left that's pro-BRICS and pro-China. China's socialist in their view. Putin's anti-imperialist in their view. Coal is okay, that's the left we deal with, the main left in South Africa. And then we have our third left, which I think is in the room here, a left that is more internationalist and ecological and anti-racist and anti-sexist and anti-imperialist and maybe socialist. I mean, this is the sort of split that Yanis Varoufakis has said reminds us of 1914, right? Lefts that go in very different ways, and the catastrophes that result from having these divisions could be enormous. And now what we can do in Johannesburg, I hope Sweden will watch us and give us encouragement, is to at least bring these three lefts together against the combined imperialist of the West, G7, and the BRICS, and that's the G20. And there's just no dispute that what G20 is up to is no good. I hope I've made that case. I can keep making that if you need, but I don't think I need to in this house. The question is, can we bring our left consciousness and our left activists into the streets, into motion, to make that case to the world? Wish us luck.
Yeah, thank you, Patrick. How we come together. Leo, is there anything else that you'd like to add at this point?
Well, there was so many, Patrick touched now really a whole range that we need hours to discuss it. I only want to stick to the World Social Forum, what you said, you're right. There was a peak of the World Social Forum in Mumbai. It also was, in terms of mobilization, the biggest mobilization on 15th of February 2003, but against the war in Iraq. But just there is and was a big discussion within the International Council between those who want just to have the World Social Forum as a meeting ground and those who said the times are so urgent that we need to have an organized way on a global level to confront the different issues by action. And that's what I wanted to say. Can I talk later on, because I'm now in a resort and they are calling me by phone?
Okay, well, I mean, if you've got to go, then you've got to go. But we're going to be finishing at the most in 18 minutes. So if you've got to go, you've got to go. That's fine. But if you can stay, we'd be delighted. The choice is yours.
Well, the choice is the directorate here.
Okay. Okay. Well, then we'll thank you very much for your participation, Leo.
Bye-bye.
Yeah. Bye-bye. And it's not visible for you, for the rest of you, men. Tord put his hand up.
Yeah, thank you very much. There is a Swedish word which you maybe can translate to me. I don't know if it exists in English, but if someone could translate it, would be you. And it's saktmod.
The courage of being slow.
Yeah, exactly. And I recently saw a webinar concerning Bhutan. And probably it was romanticized, etc. But it was fantastic, the way they were doing it. Yeah, we've been negotiating with the Chinese for 24 years. Maybe we'll continue. Yes, we think it's wrong. We are not a landlocked country. We are a land-connected country. Yes, it's interesting what happens in Southeast Asia and South Asia. Yes, maybe, etc., etc. Sort of a way of hand. I mean, it's very small number of people between the two biggest nations on earth, and somehow they maintain some kind of ability to manage the situation. And I think we look too little on these kind of things. It's very interesting. The ASEAN countries have not split up like the European Union have been doing. It's not that neutrality or non-alignment movement will disappear just because Finland and Sweden lost it. What will happen in Southern Caucasus? Nobody really knows. There are really things that are not that simple. because Georgia has 60% of its free trade agreements with Euro-Asian countries, Turkey, China, Central Asia, quite a lot, and Russia. And with the EU, it's only 20%, and the EU is using it, raising its export to Georgia, while Georgia's export is just standing still with Georgia. There are some material conditions behind what we see as, you know, presented in the media as something going on in terms of democracy, etc. So I think it's the point made here by Anuradha is important, that we maybe should, we have to admit some kind of space for being a bit tolerant and not seeing equidistance as the only solution. That there are also necessity of, in specific issue, maybe we have to look a little bit on one side. When it comes to other issues, maybe it's in the other direction, and not be too romantic about the movements. But going back to this slowness, that's where I think we have to have a different conception when it comes to communication. The basic line is that the whole digitalization of communication, that's not where we have our strength. We have our strengths in direct communication with people. And then to link to what was said by Leo, that is not necessarily only local. Of course, that's where we have our main strength. And in where we live, at the workplace and so on. That's where we have to build this sort of long distance, long strength. But those struggles locally are organized in global popular movements. They've been mentioned here, Via Campesina. There is the climate justice movement, and they meet also physically at the global level. They met at the World Social Forum, they meet in other places. Trade unions meet physically. International Peace Bureau meets physically. And that is where we have the global level, which Leo talks about. While the World Social Forum has more been a sort of ideal that has been very hard to really present itself, but both Leo and I are working for that. And that's where we need class analysis. We need an understanding that the middle class, the vanguard middle class in their party forms or the NGO form at the present stage is a disaster. They run and run and run and wants everything immediately attention to their issue. Alarm, alarm, alarm. And they don't understand that the role of the middle class is to connect the issues in such a way that we get the majority of the rural and urban majorities interested in what we are doing. It has to be related to the power struggles locally. And that's why the transition movement is important, doing things practically and then linking these things. Is it possible to start to break up a bit this enormous tensions between these middle-class vanguard people, especially in the left, I would say, but there are some other places as well where they, and that's maybe is what we need now. That's why we link peace and climate, for instance, because there is two different communities. And that is where I think the solidarity work against this oppression, and it seems to be a very important issue coming up now, that we have, they are extensionally trying to destroy us. Economically, we have our friend here from Belarus. She's called terrorist in Belarus, and she has similar problems in Lithuania where she lives, because she's also criticizing discrimination of Belarusians in Lithuania, and then she's immediately attacked from every side. And we see this necessity of, and that's where we have the interesting with Boris Kagaritsky and the need to do really substantial direct solidarity work while also addressing the global issues. So that is what, can we sort of start some process towards more tolerance? And I think we are trying to do that. End this discussion in the solidarity work with Boris Kagarlitsky and what happens in Ukraine now, because there's very interesting with India, and then build on the trust that we have to have the local base and be interested in when that local base actually organizes global movements.
Thank you. Can I turn that into a question?
Yeah.
Thank you. Class analysis mentioned, Tord, and Leo was started off with that civil society has to confront the superstructure. What we've seen from the left, well, between the left and the right, has been described as a culture war. And I saw a meme recently where they said, you know, 2025 is the year when we're going to abandon the culture war and move over into the class war. Is it, do you think, and have you seen any evidence to show sort of either way? Do you think we're going to be moving from where the right and the left are not at each other's throats, and instead everyone sort of below the capitalist class may in fact turn on the superstructure together? Patrick, you've unmuted yourself first, so you've got max 5 minutes, preferably.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always inspired when I'm, you know, talking to Luc Mélenchon's network, or the Corbyn rump. I mean, at one point running the Labour Party, nearly in 2017 taking power because of what you're suggesting, which is being attractive to a working class. In 2016, it supported Brexit to some large extent, and then in 2017, where Corbyn got 48%, he basically broke the Brexit party by taking half of their right-wing working class members into a left-wing working class agenda. Bernie Sanders maybe could have done that as well had the neoliberals not knocked him out in 2016 and 2020. The question is raised in this city, Berlin, because of the way fragmentation of the Die Linke has occurred. I'm not sure I like the way things are happening. It's a disaster. But it is a very interesting question, isn't it? Whether what had been, let's say, decisive gender and race politics could be brought back. So I would say that we've got to open up the sense of what class is and recognize the world's working class is very much gendered and majority women and also majority brown and black. I mean, it's a very different working class than had been organized in traditional Labour Party. When I read Gösta Esping Andersson's work on how Sweden put white workers from the cities with white farmers into a red-green urban-rural alliance, which I think Tord was hinting at, that's a wonderful period, and the lessons are obvious that you need universal social policies to pull people together. Maybe I'll you know, go back to my own sense of where the crisis is coming from. We worked very hard in South Africa to bring organized labor into alignment with a red-green politics of just transition, and we generally fail. There are a few wonderful exceptions, but basically labor has moved towards a defensive position in defense of jobs in the coal industry and the coal-fired power plants. But that's obviously one of the central crises, isn't it? The climate catastrophe, which hits the working class again and again with maximum intensity. Okay, maybe some people in Beverly Hills are losing their mansions, but basically it's a working class and poor people's problem, the climate catastrophe. And we have a sort of labor aristocracy of workers who defend well-paying jobs in coal-fired power plants and even coal mines. So it's a very tricky problem, isn't it, to go back to class, where we've also got to inject the question of climate. And then the other dilemma is what's happening in the world economy that's destroying jobs. This last week in South Africa, our steel industry was hammered. Probably 2/3 of it is going to die within days because of Chinese imports of steel that are highly subsidized on all sorts of levels, including apartheid labor system, the hukou system that continues in China, and the lack, let's say, of protection and capabilities to do planning. And it's ArcelorMittal, and you probably know Anu Lakshmi Mittal, a brutal man, and he's chopping away at the excesses, and he's losing market share all over the world to Chinese Hebei steel and so forth. Now, what we want to do is to look at the output of our steel industry, look at whether it's being exported into useless, avenues. We have a huge aluminium industry, and we make, tin cans for soft drinks. This is ridiculous. All sorts of big questions that only planners can ask. And I think it comes back to the most fundamental contradiction of capitalism, which is the overproduction tendencies. And the east coast of China, or Chengdu, or Chongqing, these sites of massive overproduction, huge overcapacity in the Chinese industrial sites, not just the solar and batteries and electric vehicles, but steel and aluminium and many of the most substantial products from China. And so they completely swamp the working class in South Africa that, as I say, in the ArcelorMittal foundries that are being closed, 3 of the biggest ones in Africa right now, lead to a class struggle that can also become if we're not careful, a xenophobic or yellow peril struggle. These are the problems when you do look for a return to an attention to economy and class policies. I think we've got to go deep, and that means going to Das Kapital and saying, well, what's really driving these contradictions that lead to crises in the world economy that split a Chinese working class and a Black South African working class in ways that we've got to find logical planning strategies to put them back together.
Thank you.
Very difficult. I think, as I say,
thank you, Patrick. We're going to have to. I'm going to cut you there and let Anuradha. Anuradha,
just 2 very brief comments. One, of course, we see that there's a great need for the left to come together, but at the same time, the left is the only democratic force, and there would be differences in democratic forces, and we're contesting now, a very solidified right wing. So the left needs to, just see the lowest common denominator between them and work on that. But what I see very often is that we are the left outside the left in India, outside the organized left. We are the unorganized, whatever. And but
independent left, yes.
Independent left. Or even sometimes left liberal, because we have the actual liberal values of democracy and rights for all communities and groups and individuals. But the left generally ends up attacking each other in such a bitter way, theoretically, that then the right is able to use that for their own, and they're so focused on cultural politics, on identity politics, on the other all the time. And you can see this in South Asia and Southeast Asia, this Islamophobia, the caste systems, and there's a reversal. And the working class has also got engaged in that. So the only place where there is a left government in all of India is Kerala. The only place where they went. Everywhere else they had a stronghold. They've just disappeared, and the right has come in. So the challenges are huge. But I think these debates and things like climate, etc., do bring them together. Climate, peace. And other such rights. But otherwise, there's a lot of fragmentation, and this whole, the right is so much on the rise, and they control so much that it's not easy for either the organized left or the unorganized or independent left.
Thank you. Time is 17:58. I think we'll stop it there, just so I can say thank you very much, Anuradha and Patrick, for what you've done to bring you to this place where you've explained so well for us the way you see the world, and help us perhaps come to this conclusion that we need each other across movements. And Leo, of course, is not here. We need each other across movements to not attack each other anymore, and join together to start building peace, climate justice, and the possibility for more life that the world so sorely needs. We'll take a break now, and after the break in 15 minutes, we'll be back with Aichi Parsonen, my colleague and co-conspirator in the Transition Sweden movement, and we'll be meeting 3 young voices on solidarity, peace, and climate justice. Thank you again, Patrick and Narada. Enjoy your evening. Please feel free to stick around for the rest of our evening, the rest of your evening. It's quite late for you now, I believe, I know. And we'll be back in 15 minutes. The room will be open for conversation as you like. Thank you very much.
Swedish comrades, there's just 2 words we end with from South Africa. Amandla, away to power to the people. Amandla, away to back.
Thank you.